policy of Ukraine, Mr. Viktor Ivankevich.
Уважаемый господин председатель,
Distinguished President, distinguished conference participants, on behalf of the Ukrainian delegation, I want to welcome all participants here. I hope that this session will be a valuable contribution to exchanging experience on protecting the rights of persons with disabilities. In Ukraine, the CPRD entered force in March 2010. In August 2012, the government confirmed the state program, a national plan of action on implementing the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the period running up to 2020. In August 2015, at a meeting of the UN Committee on the Rights of Disabilities in Geneva, we heard the first Ukrainian report on implementation of the UN Convention on the Rights of CRPD. Pursuant to that report, the committee adopted the concluding comments on the report. The committee called on Ukraine to remove from legislation the terminology on invalids and people with limited personal disabilities from all legislative documents and use the term that complies with the provisions of the convention. To that comment, today we've developed a bill for making changes to the law in Ukraine on ratification of the CRPD and to the optional protocols thereto, with a view to improving terminology and using the term that's the equivalent of rights of persons with disabilities. The Ukrainian government also adopted a plan of action for implementing a national strategy on human rights in the period running up 2020, where one of the priorities was ensuring the rights of persons with disabilities. This year we've developed a bill on confirming the plan of action on implementation of the concluding comments of the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, to annex the first Ukrainian periodic report on implementation of the CPRD on the period up to 2020, which includes the concluding comments of the committee, with a view to comprehensive settlement of the issue of social protection of disabled people. Today we've developed 5 bills that are before Parliament for consideration. The most important are those on which encourage companies to employ as employees persons with disabilities, and also providing elderly persons with disabilities the right to petition the courts to establish their rights before the courts. I also want to note that in spite of the need to reflect the military aggression by the Russian Federation and following the annexation of Crimea, Ukraine was forced to make significant financial spending on defense and conducting counter-terrorist operations, but with a view to improving the level of social protection of disabled people, Ukraine is still devoting significant budget funds to improve the size of pensions and benefits for persons with disabilities. In May 2015, pensions for those who are no longer able to work, for persons with disabilities and for with their children, we've raised those benefits by 5%. We've expanded the circle of people who are entitled to receive benefits for bringing up children, for persons with disabilities bringing up children. Since September last year, pensions paid to veterans of the World War II and war disabled have received tax breaks. The Parliament has also adopted a law on removing tax on pensions for all categories of citizens, including on persons with disabilities. I want to inform you that in Ukraine, a process of socialization of society is still underway when it comes to disabled people. We're creating conditions for their normal life so that they can receive education and work. In the last 10 years, we've seen that 8 institutions have been closed, and we've created different forms of care for children with disabilities and new development of social systems for provide care to families and children throughout the country. We have now 9 schools educating 2,000 children with persons with disabilities operating now. And that's a major improvement on 2002, since moreover many thousands of children receive rehabilitation services in social rehabilitation centres in the country. Creations are being created for developing rehabilitation institutions for elderly people, for adults with disabilities. Annually, more than 2,000 disabled people undergo rehabilitation and sports training in the Western Rehabilitation Centre, which after the annexation by the Russian Federation of Crimea is now one of the best rehabilitation facilities in Eastern Europe and the main base for training of sportsmen for the national Ukrainian Paralympic team. Ukraine also has 151 rehabilitation facilities, including 10 Centre for Comprehensive Rehabilitation. We should also point out that a significant impact on the implementation by of states' policy on protection of persons with disabilities is carried out by social organizations. The relationship between state structures and civil society is built on the basis of partnership. The most effective are social discussion of legal acts on the rights of PWDs and functions of state control over the activities of the authorities and local self-government. In order to address issues of rehabilitation for victims of counter-terrorist operation, procedures have been streamlined for receiving technical and other forms of rehabilitation, providing them to children and to other vulnerable groups of people. We've also established procedure for providing those resources to participants in the counter-terrorist operations, regardless of how they were rendered disabled. Budget funds are provided to provide housing for those people who've participants in counter-terrorist operations who were injured or wounded. To address the problem of rehabilitation, besides budget funds, financial assistance also sought from international organizations such as NATO, OSCE, UNDP.
Постановление правительства.
By a government decree of February this year, there was approval of an implementational agreement between the Ukrainian Cabinet of Ministers and NATO on support and implementation of cooperation in the field of medical rehabilitation, cooperation on psychological rehabilitations for participants in the counter-terror operations. For this, there is an agreement in existence between Ukraine, Bulgaria, Israel, USA. There are problems that do require that need to be settled, including a barrier-free environment. In spite of the Ukrainian legislational procedures for providing accessibility to infrastructure, we still see cases of violation of these procedures and failure of certain facilities to meet the requirements of the disabled. It's difficult to tackle these questions for existing trade facilities, but the government is aware that tackling these problems is an absolute priority. The emphasis here was placed in the concluding comments on the first Ukrainian report, in which the committee advised carrying out monitoring and implementation of accessibility standards. Summing up, I want to note that Ukraine has defined its progress towards international principles and values. We'll do our utmost to ensure that those standards should concern absolutely all citizens of Ukraine. The policy of inclusion of disabled people here is particularly significant. Thank you.
I thank the Deputy Minister of Ukraine for his statement. I now give the floor to the Deputy Minister for Social Development of South Africa, Ms. Henrietta Zulu.